Hey guys, what is going on? It's Jake here from Vantage Point Economics. Welcome to episode 2. Today we're going to be looking at quantitative easing, or QE, as it's more commonly known. I'm going to do a few videos on this topic. I believe it's a very important topic. It's very relevant to understanding the macro environment that the economy is in. So hopefully this video will be a little bit shorter, a little bit more to the point. And yeah, let's just dive right into the slides that I have prepared for you today. Cheers. Okay then guys, let's get straight into these slides then and have a look at today's topic. So, quantitative easing, or QE, and its effects. So we've got a nice little image here of the central bank. This is the Bank of England. So as my viewers, you can probably tell I'm from the UK. So I'm going to be coming at this really from a sort of UK angle. And I'll share with you a lot of the research that I've done about QE. I've done using sort of resources that are actually provided by the Bank of England, so we can be sure that we're getting a right understanding of what's going on. So let's take a look then. The first slide we have then, QE, an introduction. So let's take a look at the first item then. The purpose of QE is to stimulate the economy. So when we think about quantitative easing, when does it happen? And we can think back to the last financial crisis in 2008. It was a technique that was employed then in 2008-09. And more recently, after COVID-19, quantitative easing was a method that the central banks and the government used in order to help elevate the economy out of this sort of predicament that it was in. I don't know if you remember, very quickly after COVID-19 hit us in April, the stock prices completely crashed. And so QE was a very serious and very important part of the recovery of the market prices during that time. So the next point then, QE is performed by central banks, i.e. governments. So who really controls the central bank? Who controls the Federal Reserve? Who controls the Bank of England? And really, it is just the government. It's a public organisation. It doesn't have private shareholders. Now, there are some central banks in the world that are controlled by private shareholders, but certainly from my research, the UK and the US, these central banks are controlled by the government. So in a nutshell, QE involves creating new money and pumping it into the economy, which is true. However, the way that they create these new funds and the way that they put this money into the economy is very interesting, and it's very sort of odd, but we're going to explore that together. I'm going to try and hopefully explain this in a way that's very easy, very simple, and it will help you think through and understand the impacts that QE will have on the financial system. So the economy can be split into two different sub-economies. These are called the real economy and the financial economy. So in a nutshell, think about the real economy. That is made up of goods and services that consumers and businesses need on a daily basis. If you go to the shops and buy some groceries, you are taking part in the real economy. If you were to go and buy a car at the weekends from a dealership, you'd be taking part in the real economy. But there's this other economy, this other sort of space of assets, and we call this the financial economy. So this is essentially all of the financial markets. So you've got the stock market, the debt market, which is made up of bonds and other debt instruments, and you've got also the derivative market as well. This is sort of options and futures and forward contracts, things like this. These are very complex financial instruments that are used and owned by large financial institutions and really don't have anything to do with Joe Bloggs. I mean, of course, the stock market, Joe Bloggs is involved in that a fair bit, but generally the financial economy is reserved for those large financial institutions, whereas the real economy is what affects Joe Bloggs. That is the day-to-day economy that we live in. So the second point I'll make about these two different economies is that the financial economy, the total value of it, absolutely dwarfs the real economy. So if you were to think of an analogy, maybe the real economy is a golf ball and the financial economy is like a beach ball. It's huge, it's enormous, and it's the enormity of it that that is an issue as well, which we'll come to understand as we study QE a bit more. So let's go on to the next bullet point then. QE is portrayed to have a positive impact on both the real and the financial economy. So when the central bank goes to do these things, they say this is a good thing. It's good for the financial markets, and it's good also for real businesses and real people. This is a positive thing. We must do this to rescue the economy. So it appears to have a much greater impact on the financial economy. So we're thinking about who really benefits from QE. What impact does it really have? And who does it benefit? And, if it benefits mostly the real economy, then that's real people that are going to be uplifted and benefiting from it. However, if it affects the financial economy much more, then it's going to be those big institutions and banks and funds and pension funds and hedge funds, things like this. It'll be those guys, the Wall Street, who are benefiting from it. So let's take a deeper dive then. Let's have a look at our next slide. So how does it work then? Quantitative easing, how does it work? Step 1, creation of reserves. So this is what they do when they announce we're going to do 10 billion. We're going to walk through now how that process works. So here we have central bank before the execution of QE. So its balance sheet is at a neutral position. It hasn't got any extra cash, no extra assets, extra liabilities. It's in a neutral position. So the central bank after the execution of QE. So in this example I'm showing, just for example's sake, we're going to say that the central bank runs QE on a given date of £500 million. So after they've executed quantitative easing program of £500 million, the government balance sheet would look a bit like this. So you'd have cash of 500 million, and you think, oh, how have they done that? Well, they've just made it out of thin air. They have created new cash, and the way they do this is simply by it's all electronic, isn't it? So they can just go to their keyboard and literally create new cash reserves. Now, I stress the word reserves. These are labelled as, they're reserves. But essentially it's just creating cash out of thin air. So what do they do with that cash? That is the important thing. So let's take a look. Quantitative easing, step 2, the purchase of assets. Oh, okay. So, so before, here we go, before. We've got this before image again, which help us understand, well, what's the position of the central bank and of the financial economy before. So before, we've got our 500 million of cash, which we've newly created. So we've got our newly created 500 million there in the central bank, which is owned by the government. And if we were to look at a high street bank, a pension scheme, or a hedge fund, so these are entities, organisations that are controlled by the private sector. They might have assets on their balance sheet of, say, 500 million. Let's just say they've got some government bonds and some corporate debt, and it totals up to 500 million. Now, what the central bank is going to do, it's going to create its newly printed 500 million, and it's going to go in to the financial markets. It's going to go in to the debt market, and it's going to buy from the private sector assets. It's going to buy government bonds primarily, and it's going to buy corporate bonds. So let's read them. The central bank has purchased government bonds, corporate debt, and other financial assets from the financial market. So if this is the position before, newly printed 500 million of cash, the assets are still owned by the private sector, the transaction happens, and let's follow the arrow down. What happens after this transaction has taken place? So, oh look, they've swapped over. So now the central bank has 500 million of assets, which will be made up of government bonds, corporate debt, possibly other things, we just don't know. And look, the private sector, oh, well, they've got the cash now. They've done a swap. So if we follow the movement of the cash flow, the cash was created in the central bank in this first step. from nothing, and it's flown to the private sector, to the high street banks, the pension schemes, and the hedge funds, the people that own government bonds and government treasuries. So they have now sold their government bonds and government treasuries and gone from having 500 million of assets to 500 million of cash. Fantastic. Let's read the second bullet then. The financial entities, the high street banks, the pension schemes, and the hedge funds have received cash in return for the sale of assets. And that essentially is it, guys. That is QE. And on the face of it, you think, oh, okay, right, that doesn't seem to do an awful lot. But let's explore now what this actually does and what impact this has on the economy. This creation of reserves from nothing and then using this to purchase assets from the financial markets. Let's take a look. So QE, the impact. Execution of QE has several far-reaching impacts on the economy. We will take some time in this video to consider a handful of the key impacts. This is an important point to mention, guys. I'm going to do a number of videos on QE because its impacts are very far-reaching. There's so many consequences. So we're going to have to look at that over a number of videos. I do believe there are some further hidden impacts. So, guys, I think there's impacts that aren't necessarily discussed on this video, but I'm not going to talk about these today. I'll talk about these another day, which I'll be explaining in another video. Okay, brilliant. So the impacts I'm going to go through with you today are the impacts that I have studied and researched, and the main sort of party that is agreeing with this impact is the Bank of England itself. I got a lot of this research and a lot of this data and a lot of these consequences I have researched, and they've been reported on the Bank of England's own website. So I do believe that to be a reputable source. I mean, some might say you can't trust what they say, but what essentially I want to capture in this video is the main impact that QE should have on the economy. So let's take a look then. So QE, the impact: higher financial asset prices, lower yield, cheaper borrowing costs. And that is sort of a step-by-step domino effect as well, okay? So let's have a little look at this then. So, excuse me, we've got this chart here, which is going to be very helpful. And again, what I think is helpful is looking at this before and this after diagram. So before the QE, government bonds cost 100, corporate bonds cost 100, and stocks cost 100. The yield of bonds before is 3%. The yield of government bonds is 3% before. The yield of corporate bonds is 6% before, yeah. So we would say that government bonds are much safer, or generally safer than corporate bonds, yeah. So it's going to be a lower yield. And the yield on equities, which is riskier again in theory, is 10%. So we've got this nice risk arrow. This arrow is pointing us in the direction of risk. So we know the higher the risk, the higher the yield that you'll get on that asset. Yeah, yield being the return on the assets versus the cost of purchasing those assets, or the market value of those assets. So what happens after? Well, the price has gone up. Oh, the prices have gone up. So government bonds have gone up from 100 to 150. Why is that? Well, think about it, guys. The government is creating cash out of thin air and going to the market and saying, look, we've got cash, we're ready to buy bonds, sell us bonds. And what do we know? When demand for a good or service or debt instrument increases, then the price will increase, yeah? Higher demand tends to lead to higher prices unless there's an offsetting supply increase. So suddenly, wow, the government's come in, they want to buy all of these bonds. Well, that's going to cost you because the price has to go up. And so we see, well, okay, if the price goes up, what's the impact of that? Well, the yield is going to go down because these bonds might be fixed rate 1% per annum bonds. That 1% on a higher price is going to be a lower yield. So that's why we see the yield fall from 3 to 2. So let's have a think about some further implications then. The central bank, they've printed all this cash, they've used it to go out and buy bonds. That's driven the price of bonds up. A further effect is, well, hang on a minute, all of these pension schemes, hedge funds, whatever it is that have sold the bonds to the government, suddenly they've got a load of cash on hand, and they're thinking, oh, we've got a load of cash on hand, we need to do something with it. So what are they going to do? Well, they take that cash on hand, and they're not going to use it to buy government bonds because they've just sold government bonds. So they're going to take that cash on hand and they're going to spread it into other assets. So they're going to spread it into maybe the corporate debt market to buy corporate bonds. Or maybe they're going to spread it into the equity market and they're going to buy stocks. And what will that do? Well, again, it's this same supply and demand equation. The more demand there is for a good or asset or instrument, the higher its price will be pushed up. So what you see as well is government bonds might go up from, say, $100 to $150. Well, so will corporate bonds. They'll go up as a consequence as well due to this trickle-down effect. And then stocks will go up. And guys, think back to the COVID crash. How long did it last? I mean, it lasted about 2 or 3 months. We're back up to all-time highs now, Not in the UK, but certainly in the US, we're back up there. And you think, well, why is that? They did QE, tons of QE, trillions and trillions. And we're back where we are again. And I'd imagine, I can't be certain, but I think that QE has a lot to do with that. Okay, let's run through these bullets then quickly. So, when the central bank buys up government bonds, the price of the bonds are pushed upwards, okay? The heightened price results in the bonds generating lower yield. I think we've discussed that. Generally, big institutions want to balance their portfolios. Theoretically, if an institution has a target yield, they will need to exchange a safe asset for a riskier one in order to generate the required yield. So this is the trickle-down effect, guys. If they were getting 3% on their government bonds, but now they're only getting 2%, you might say, well, I need to reposition into some riskier assets in order to get my yield back up. So this is going to drive up the corporate debt market. It's going to drive up the equities markets, yeah? As funds flow to other financial markets, e.g. the stock market, the prices of these assets are increased. So here's an interesting point, guys. Lowering the yield across debt instruments means that borrowing is cheaper for average Joe. This increases borrowing and subsequently therefore spending, boosting the real economy. Now, this makes sense if you think about it. So if the yield on, for example, corporate bonds decreases because of quantitative easing, then that is essentially saying the cost of borrowing for companies has decreased, and therefore interest rates have decreased. So that's good for everyone, well, everyone that wants to borrow anyway. We won't go into a detail about the wisdom of borrowing on this video, but what the government wants to do, or what the central bank wants to do, is by reducing the cost of borrowing, by driving yields down, driving interest rate down, they want to encourage spending. They think that if people see that borrowing is cheap, they will go out, they will borrow, and they will plough that money into the real economy. Now, all of this is theoretical, and actually, I haven't got any statistics available right now, but it makes you question, doesn't it? Of this QE and of this cash that was generated, how much of it does actually trickle down to the real economy? How much of that 500 million are people thinking, oh, you know what, I'm going to go and get a 10 grand loan and I'm going to, buy a new car? I wonder how much does actually trickle down. Okay, finally then, guys, we're going to look at this last slide, which is the concerns. And like I've said, I'm going to do a number of other videos. We'll talk about QE in more detail, cover some of the more nuanced issues. But let's just fire through these concerns then. So many economists are concerned about the impact QE might have on the long-term health of the economy. Economists are unsure how much of QE money ends up in the real economy. Do you remember at the start we spoke about this real economy, goods, services, shopping basket, cars at the weekend, and then this financial economy, this monolith of derivatives, futures, forwards, options, calls, puts, the banking system, the financial system. how much of that ends in the real economy compared to how much is absorbed by the financial economy? And this is known as the trickle-down impact. Touched on that briefly on the last slide, this trickle-down impact. How much of that 5 million that they've printed trickles down into the lives of average Joe, people like you or I? There are concerns that creating money out of thin air will result in high and possibly runaway levels of inflation. This is debated since many believe that due to the low level of trickle-down, the funds remain trapped in the financial economy and therefore will not result in real inflation, or CPI, which is one way of measuring real inflation, known as the Consumer Price Index. Essentially, how much does your weekly shop cost? So this is a very important point, and it's debated a lot, and it's something that certainly I will cover in other videos about QE. But there's this sort of rhetoric that goes around that says, you know, if you print money out of thin air and you throw that into the economy, you know, real or financial, it's going to eventually one day result in inflation. When we increase the money supply, when we increase the amount of pounds, increase the amount of dollars that are circulating in this big system, we will, you know, if the amount of services and goods remain unchanged, then you will cause inflation. Think of price as money divided by goods and services. If money goes up, then price will have to go up where goods and services are fixed. So this is a very interesting conversation, very interesting debate. Lots of people think this and that, but yeah, I've got some interesting thoughts on that I will be sharing in future videos. So then let's look down at this last bullet point then. So I believe there is a further hidden impact on the real economy that occurs when the central bank buys up government bonds. So from a very high level point of view, I'll share this thought with you, but essentially when the main asset that the central banks buy when they conduct QE is government bonds. Now this, hang on a minute, if the government controls the central bank and then they buy government debt, then essentially they're buying their own debt. And you think, how does that work? They're buying debt that, you know, they're essentially buying money that they owe to themselves. And so it's very confusing, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I will be doing a secondary further video on this. And, you know, I think that if the government buys its own debts, but it uses borrowed money to run, you know, spending, it's doing, you know, infrastructure projects in the country, you know, running just general government expenses, you know, running the NHS, running teachers, paying for police, all of these costs, all of these public costs. I do see an issue where the government is going out and paying for all of these things, you know, the welfare system, you know, it's paying for all that out of debt, but then that debt it actually is buying back, and it's buying it back with money that's created out of thin air. So that's a very high level thought on that, but I'll do a further video where we can talk more about that. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video today about QE. I hope it's a little bit more speedy than the last one. I hope it's informative. Like I say, any questions, get in the comments below and reach out to me, and I'll answer your questions. And yeah, thanks guys, take care, bye bye.